Okay, so today we are going to be doing the second part of the nervous system notes, and we're going to be focusing on how a neuron works. So before we go into detail about how a message is transmitted in a neuron, we're going to do a little bit of review as far as the structure of a neuron. So here I have a picture of a neuron, and yes, it does look a little wonky, but that's okay. It's good enough. So I would have this kind of sketch somewhere in your notes. And the first structure that we're going to go over is the dendrites. The first structure that we're going to go over is the dendrites, which are going to be these kind of pointy structures on the left-hand side of this neuron. And so the dendrites is where a message is going to come into the neuron, and that's going to happen through something known as neurotransmitters. And these are just tiny little chemical molecules that were released by a neuron before this one, and they just kind of, get sent through the synaptic cleft, which is the space between the neurons, and they're going to come and they're going to bind to this neuron, and that's how it receives a message. Once the message is received by this neuron, these neurotransmitters are going to cause different changes in this part of the neuron. This is known as the cell body. So in this part of the neuron, you're going to find the nucleus, which stores the DNA for the neuron, and it's also where the message is going to be kind of deciphered, and the neuron's going to figure out how it's going to keep pushing that message forward. So once the message has been processed or integrated in the cell body, that message is going to be accumulated at this point. This is the axon hillock. This is going to act as the sort of gatekeeper. It's known as the threshold, which basically means that the message that is integrated in the cell body has to be strong enough to overcome this threshold. That's kind of like the minimum strength that the signal has to be in order for it to keep moving forward. All right, so we're going to assume that the signal is strong enough to go past the axon hillock. And so that message is going to then make its way all the way down the axon. So the axon basically is just a passageway that connects the cell body to the axon terminals. The signal that is carried by the axon is also known as an action potential, and for the purposes of the nervous system and as we go through the senses next semester, we're going to refer to these signals as a nerve impulse. So the message, this nerve impulse, goes from the cell body to the axon hillock, down the axon, and eventually it's going to make its way to the very end of the neuron, to these little kind of feet or fingers, and these are known as the axon terminal. So once the nerve impulse gets to these axon terminals, it is going to be passed on to the next cell. So that message is going to be relayed. The next cell can be either a neuron, it could also be a different type of body cell. For example, it could be a muscle fiber. So to connect that to the muscle system, if we have a muscle here, so you have all these different fibers, and let's say this was a muscle saying, or a muscle found in your forearm. Okay, so this would be a neuron that sent a signal to the forearm for it to contract. And so once the message reaches these axon terminals, it's going to release that neurotransmitter that you should kind of be familiar with, which was acetylcholine. So acetylcholine travels from the neuron and then binds to the muscle. And then this neurotransmitter is what caused the muscle to release calcium, and then the muscle was then able to contract. So these neurotransmitters at the very end that are released by the neuron is how that message gets passed on from one cell to another. All right, so the last thing that I want to touch on about a neuron before we move on to the actual steps of an action potential or a nerve impulse is the conditions of the neuron. So the first thing is the charge of the neuron at rest. So the neuron is going to have a overall negative charge while it's just kind of sitting there. Nothing's really going on. And this negative charge is actually accomplished by proteins inside of the neuron that are really, really negative. While on the outside of the neuron, we're going to think of it as having a positive charge. So the difference in charge from the outside and inside of the cell is what causes the neuron to be known as polarized. So this change in charge or difference in charge is accomplished by something known as the sodium potassium pump. And we'll get a little more information about this in a little bit. Okay, so now that we've gone over the various structures of the neuron and kind of what their role is, we're going to go through the steps of an action potential or a nerve impulse. So the first thing, we're going to start off with the axon being at rest. So when the axon is at rest, or the neuron is at rest, we're going to, for the purposes of this class, we're going to say that it is at negative 90 millivolts. Okay, and don't forget that this charge is maintained by little proteins found within the axon, and these have like a negative charge, and then you also have the sodium potassium pump that is kind of keeping the resting charge. Okay, so the nerve is then going to get some sort of signal. It's going to get a message from a neighboring cell. And so then this signal is going to be the event or the stimulus. And this is going to cause a response inside of the neuron. So that event or stimulus is going to cause the internal charge of the neuron to start changing towards a positive. And this charge is going to have to accumulate at the base of the axon. So that's the axon hillock. And at this point, that's where the charge needs to be strong enough to overcome this kind of barrier. And that is known as the all or nothing phenomenon. So that all or nothing is going to be a change that has to reach at least negative 50 millivolts. So that's going to be the threshold. If the voltage change does not reach that negative 50, then no impulse is going to take place, no message is going to be sent. But if the change reaches that negative 50, then the nerve impulse or the action potential can then make its way down the axon and send the message to the next cell. So assuming that it did reach the threshold, then the neuron is going to begin to progressively get more and more positive, and that's going to be known as the depolarization. So that depolarization is actually going to happen kind of like a domino effect. So it's going to start at the axon hillock, and what's going to happen is that since it reached the threshold here, it's going to allow some channels to open, and those channels are going to allow positive charged ions to enter the neuron. And so the neuron's going to begin to get more and more positive. And so once it's positive in this area, then it's going to, once again, be like a domino effect. Right next to it, the channels will then open, allowing more positive ions to come into the neuron, into this axon area, changing it from negative to positive. And then it's just going to go all the way down the axon. It's going to start turning positive all the way down. And then it's eventually going to reach the axon terminals, which is the end of the neuron. So at these terminals, this is where you have little bubbles of chemicals, and those chemicals are your neurotransmitters. My pen's a little yucky, but those neurotransmitters, like for example, we had acetylcholine when we talked about muscles. So those neurotransmitters are going to be released, and then they're going to travel to whatever cell they're meant to go to. It could be another neuron, it could be muscle, your stomach, your heart, your lungs, whatever is trying to communicate with. And so that depolarization is going to result in that message being sent. So after the message is sent, the neuron then has to go back to its resting state. And the movement of the charge from positive back to negative, to that negative 70, is known as the repolarization. So first, the neuron depolarizes, and we're actually going to say that depolarization makes the neuron go to about positive 40 millivolts. So now it needs to make its way back down to negative 70. So the repolarization of the neuron is going to mostly be accomplished by a really specialized protein known as the sodium-potassium pump. And what that's going to do is going to pump out positive ions, or it's going to pump out more positive ions out of the axon than it's letting in. So it's going to only let 2 in while it pumps out 3. So this is going to slowly bring the charge in the neuron back down to a negative charge. So it's going to start making its way back to its resting state. However, the neuron is actually going to overshoot, meaning that it's going to become even more negative than negative 70. So it's going to go past the resting point, and this is known as hyperpolarization. So this hyperpolarization is actually really, really important in making sure that the neuron is able to function correctly. This period of hyperpolarization is going to allow the neuron to kind of stabilize and return to normal. And by the charge going all the way down to negative 80 is going to give it enough time to stabilize by preventing another action potential from happening, or another message trying to be sent through that neuron. So that's the gist of how a nerve impulse gets started and travels down the neuron. The last thing that I want to go over is how, or another way that this can be displayed. You typically see this process shown in a graph form. And so that's what we're going to go through right now, kind of see how each step is shown in the graph. So the first thing you want to do is you want to label your y-axis, and the lowest value that we're going to have is going to be that negative 80 millivolts. All these numbers are just, for this class. If you, take anatomy later on, and like the college level, you'll see that these charges vary from one neuron to another, depending on their location and what kind of message they're trying to send and all that good stuff. So these are for the purposes of this class. So we have our -80, -70, then we have our -50, which is our threshold. So this is our minimum. So I'm going to put this over here. This is the threshold for the all or nothing. And then our highest will be positive 40 millivolts. All right, so you typically see this nerve impulse shown as kind of a roller coaster ride. Think of it like the Titan or something. So you start at 70, then it goes up. It's a little wonky, but that's okay. And then it shoots back down, and then it goes back to 70. All right, so step 1 was the axon being at rest, and that charge is our -70. So this is going to be step number 1. We're at rest. And then step number 2 is some sort of event, some stimulus. So something takes place that is going to cause the internal charge of the neuron to start to change to positive. So somewhere over here. And so this is step 2. This is our event. Okay. And for that event to lead to a nerve impulse or an action potential, it has to be high enough to cross the threshold. So this is our all or nothing. So assuming that the change was high enough to cross the threshold, that's going to cause the change in the internal charge of the neuron to shoot up and become positive, and that's going to lead to the depolarization. So that's going to be our 3rd step. So this is the depolarization, where the charge went from negative all the way to positive. And so then the message is sent, and now the neuron needs to go back to its resting state. And so that's going to happen thanks to the sodium-potassium pump. And that's known as the repolarization. We're going back down to negative. And so you have positive ions being pumped out faster than they're coming in. But the neuron is actually going to overshoot, and it's going to cause the neuron to become a lot more negative, which is known as your hyperpolarization. And that's where it's going to reach at about -80. And then once it has enough time to kind of stabilize and it's not interrupted by any other action potential, it'll kind of level off, and then it'll go back to -70, and then you start back at step number 1. Okay, and that's pretty much it. That's the gist of how an action potential happens, or nerve impulse. And just make sure you're familiar with pretty much everything on here. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing. I'll post another video of someone else kind of going over it. If you have any questions or anything like that, just let me know.